The White House on attack this week against House Republicans, saying they would rather go on vacation than address national security issues. Despite the administration's calls to delay its recess, the House is now on its holiday break as issues surrounding the southern border, aid for Ukraine, Israel, and elsewhere remain in limbo. Joining me now, California Democratic Congressman Khanna. Congressman, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Thank you for having me back.
Okay, so why did the White House, the president himself, wait so long to get involved here? Has it been wasted time?
Well, Sean, let me start out where I agree with Senator Cornyn, and that is that no backroom deal on the border without the involvement of the House Hispanic Caucus, Latino senators is going to pass. And it's not going to pass in the House, both because of Democrats and conservatives. The House has to be at the negotiating table. We want a safe border. We want an orderly and humane process. But I agree with Senator Cornyn that the negotiation hasn't involved the relevant people.
Well, and what do you make of that? Because we've had a number of members come forward of Latino congressmen and women and senators to say, how are we not part of this discussion? How are we not at the table?
I don't understand it. I mean, I think there's this view sometimes, because a lot of senators become president, that you could just have the White House and the Senate come up with a deal and somehow jam the House. But the House is still the people's house, and we're going to have our say. We need to be involved. You have to at least have someone like Nanette Berrigan, the chair of the Hispanic Caucus, at the table. You need to have some of the Latino senators at the table. Now, look, we need a secure border. We need more funding for immigration agents, for the Border Patrol, and we can have a conversation, but they're not even at the table.
Okay, let's talk about this, because Vox is among those that thinks a deal is going to come together. There is a lot of skepticism, I think, that the Senate's going to get this done in the next few days. But they think a deal is likely for a number of reasons. First, the horrible poll numbers across our polls and every other poll out there on how the president is handling the border, but also because he's facing pressure on so many different sides. They write this: more and more Democrats have grown uncomfortable with the border and asylum situation in the Biden years, which have featured a dramatic surge in border crossings and asylum requests. On top of that, we have members within the Biden administration who are warning about the growing number of people on terror watch lists that are showing up at the border, the growing threat of people coming across and being motivated to use the open border for a terror attack. This week, warning to border agents that there were IEDs found along the border. With all of that and these increasing numbers, do you agree that the border is out of control at this point? Are you one of these Democrats, as Vox says, who's become uncomfortable about what's going on there?
I agree that we need a solution to the border and that we need to do more to secure the border. What I would do is something that the House Democrats have done, which is pass more funding for Border Patrol agents, pass more funding for immigration judges, and have a conversation about how we secure the border. But what we can't do is just have certain ideas, in my view, like getting rid of parole, which allowed us to have Ukrainian refugees here, Afghan refugees here that fought with us in Afghanistan, just doing away with it. That I don't think actually makes the border more secure, because it'll just have more people come to the border. So we need a rational solution, and we certainly need House members involved in the conversation.
Well, okay, House members getting involved. The House GOP wants something much closer to H.R. 2, as we talked about with Senator Cornyn. It is much tougher than what we've heard being floated over in the Senate. One of the things it would include is a measure that would require employers to use some kind of system to verify the legal status of people that they employ. One of our brand new Fox News polls out this morning shows that 64% of people support punishing employers who hire people who are here in the U.S. illegally. When you break it down by party, it's a majority of Democrats and Republicans who believe that employers should have to face some penalties. Would you support a measure like that, verification?
I would support holding employers accountable. The problem with verification is it often ends up punishing people who are undocumented and the families, and not the employers. If we're holding the employers accountable for breaking the law and underpaying folks, I am for that. I also think that it has to be part of a border agreement that does something for the DACA folks and has some path to citizenship. And this is why we need to have a conversation with all parties on board. But I just want to be clear, right now in the House, you're both going to have conservatives and Democrats vote against something that just is going to come from the Senate. So I'm not sure what they're trying to achieve. And why not just have a clean bill on the Ukraine aid and the other aid? I mean, we would be able to pass that through the House.
Well, let's talk about that, because one of the biggest Ukraine hawks, Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican who wants to make sure there's no break in funding of military aid or other aid, he sounds very skeptical that something's going to come together on the border that would convince him to vote for that Ukraine aid. Here's what he said this week.
I look forward to voting no to a bad deal next week. I hope they bring up an immigration proposal that doesn't do the job to see if I'll vote no. I will gladly vote no to a bad deal next week. I am not going to be pressed to do something that doesn't make sense.
So listen, he is one of the loudest voices for getting more aid to Ukraine. How worried are you hearing that from him?
I'm concerned, and I agree that we should just separate the issues. I mean, why are we trying to rush comprehensive immigration reform that we haven't been able to do for 20 to 30 years in a few weeks right before the Christmas holidays and link it to aid to Ukraine? I mean, the whole Republican caucus, one of the reasons they got rid of Speaker McCarthy is they said have single issue votes. Don't tie things that are unconnected. Let's have a clean up or down vote on aid to Ukraine. If people are philosophically opposed, give them the right to oppose. I believe you'd have 300 House members who vote for it. And that's really, in my view, what we need.
Would you also separate a standalone issue for Israeli aid, or do you think that should be tied to Ukraine as well?
I think that's fine to have Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan as a supplemental aid. I mean, we could do it separately, but that at least is all dealing with national security, foreign policy issues, and let people vote their conscience. But to tie foreign policy issues and the president's requests on foreign policy to a border policy, and then not to involve the chair of the Hispanic caucus, not to involve any Latino senators, not to involve any House members, and to just assume that the Senate is going to cut some deal and the House is just going to ratify it, is to forget Article 1 of the Constitution and the role of the House of Representatives.
Okay, I want to talk to you about something the House did do this week, which was vote to move forward on an impeachment inquiry. We have some polling out this morning on this issue. When it comes to whether the president was involved in Hunter's business or did something related to it, 38% told us they think he did something illegal. This is the president. 27% say something unethical. So that's 65% of Americans who think something shady went on there with regard to the president and Hunter's business. And now we have a flip on impeachment. There are now more Americans who tell us they believe it's a legitimate inquiry than a bogus inquiry. That has flipped since we last polled this in September. Do you have any curiosity about the changing story from the White House, the testimony from the IRS whistleblowers, anything that has come forward so far? Do you feel like you need answers?
I don't think the president did anything wrong as president of the United States. Look, when you impeach someone, it's because they took conduct as president that was violated the law. And there's not a shred of evidence of that. This whole thing with Hunter Biden was litigated extensively for 5 years in the 2020 campaign. And if people want to litigate the president's past life and the details of finances and Hunter Biden's finances in 2024, fine. Litigate it as an election issue. I spoke out against the censorship of the story in the New York Post. But don't take up the time of the Congress when the president hasn't done anything wrong as president of the United States.
Well, that is where the two parties have quite a difference of opinion. Again, we'll follow that into the new year as that impeachment inquiry is now official and moving forward. Congressman Khanna, thank you very much always for your time. Great to see you today.
Thank you, Shannon. Merry Christmas and happy holidays to your viewers.
And to you as well. Thank you, sir.